Welcome to the Over the Hump podcast. Your gateway to the world of the iconic Brahman breed of cattle. At BRC Ranch, our passion for Brahman cattle runs deep. Join us as we delve into the heart of this extraordinary breed, unveiling its rich history, exploring industry trends, and sharing captivating stories that define the American Brahman. BRC Ranch stands as the pinnacle of Brahman excellence in America, boasting a decade-long legacy of champions and housing the finest Brahman bulls worldwide. It's not just about cattle, it's about a legacy that reverberates across ranches and hearts. Brought to you by BRC Ranch, where the Brahman legacy thrives and stories are woven into the very fabric of ranching. This is Over the Hump. And now your hosts, Brendan Cutrer, Rachel Cutrer, and Keaton Dodd.
I'd like to welcome everybody back to another episode of the Over the Hump podcast. I'm Keaton Dodd. With me is Brendan Cutrer, and very, very excited. A fun guest that we bring to you. And I know a lot of people in the Brahman breed are very familiar with Joe and his family's program. But for those that are unaware, Joe, would you just go ahead and take this opportunity to kind of introduce yourself and your operation?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. Looking forward to telling you a little bit about us. We started our operation independently in 1993. But I'm a fifth generation Brahman breeder. We go back all the way to the late 1800s. So had Brahman cattle in our family for well over 100 years in some form or fashion. Most of that was over in Jackson County with my great-great-grandfather Lafayette Ward. And funny story, not a lot of people know, but Bubba Sartwell's grandfather used to work for Ward Land and Cattle Company, and so our ties go back all the way to the early days of the Sartwell family, and just have kind of bounced around Texas, ended up over here in George West and Live Oak County, and that's kind of where I come on. And we've been here now 32 years, trying to keep the tradition going and have our own herd and sort of our own philosophy, but it all sort of ties back to those early days, right after the first importation. So yeah, we've sort of been around, but we keep a low profile. I know a lot of you guys know Bubba Sartwell. His grandfather actually worked for the ranch, worked for Lafayette Ward. And so we go back to the early days of the Sartwell family, been around in this business over 100 years, and I'm just sort of carrying on the family tradition. I've been at it 32 years here in Live Oak County, and just trying to do the best we can to kind of keep it going.
Yeah, so Joe, all along growing up, reading Brahman history and all of that stuff, I knew of the Ward Cattle Company and Lafayette Ward and Mr. Sartwell's involvement and all that, but I didn't realize the connection between you and there. So this is awesome that you have that super historical connection that goes all the way back, to the bedrock of the breed. And that just blows my mind right now. And I can't tell you how excited I am for you to tell us a little more about that.
Sure. It never really got a lot of publicity. I think Lafayette's business actually went, for lack of a better term, they kind of went busted bankrupt in 1918. And those cattle were put into receivership by the courts. And that was how the Sartwell family sort of ended up, kind of intertwined in our family after working with them. The courts put them in charge of that operation. So it didn't really get a lot of traction going forward, but it went down through the generations. My dad was in the business for, probably a solid 25 years. And some of you might recognize those prefixes in the pedigrees. If you go back and look at some of the bulls like Bravo and 2 over 34 and Lady Ward 2 over 27, you'll see that name, and that's actually my dad, but it was carried on from the early days of Lafayette. So it sprinkled in there, and we probably didn't do a good job of self-promoting, but that's sort of the history, the long and short of it.
Would there have been any of that cow herd from way back that was kind of maintained and carried on through, or is it kind of been some turnover genetically since then. Obviously, you would have brought in some new animals, but are there any old Ward blood cattle that are still running around today?
There's a little bit of that, but most of that is gone. I would say there's probably a little bit of Bravo that you still see around. There was a bull that my dad had, was a Cherokee 1/356. You might see something like that in there. It's sprinkled around, but I guess the short answer is when we got started in 1993, we went in a completely different direction. My dad was primarily a red breeder, and we decided when we got into this that we would go more gray and sort of carve out our own bloodline. So most of what we have will be totally different and new compared to what the original Ward cattle would have been. And that's sort of why we didn't keep that prefix. We wanted to sort of separate ourselves out. So we went with the Lazy J, but it's all still the same, still the same family and the family land, but just a different bloodline and a different program.
Well, Joe, I feel like you're being a little bit modest there when you mention some of those names like Ward's Bravo and 2/34 and the Cherokee 1/356 bull and some of that, because those were extremely influential animals and still are today, especially on the red side of things. But I think like 2/34 at one time might have been the number one red bull in the Register of Renown. Of course, Bravo, everybody knows who that bull is, but you would have been around and I guess a whole lot younger when these animals were around. Do you remember many of those animals?
I probably would remember Bravo the best, just from, he was one of the later bulls that Dad had, and those other ones I would have been too young, and I really didn't get, intimately involved in the ranch early on growing up. Wish I would have, but just didn't like it as much or appreciate it as much as a kid, and didn't get back into it until I was about 18. That would have been in 1993 when I came back full time and started. And by then, the red cattle were gone, and we were transitioning into the gray cattle. So I don't remember personally a lot of those bulls other than Bravo, but I remember, hearing about them and seeing the pictures and visiting with some of the people. But we did not stay in the red side of things. We gravitated more to the grays, and Dad had a lot of gray cattle, probably had several hundred gray cattle back growing up. And I just liked them more. It was what I was familiar with. And when I got into it, I wanted to sort of cut my own trail. So we went into the gray genetics.
I got you. We'll put a pin in that because I do want to come back to kind of the bloodlines that make up your herd as it sits today. But I feel like we left out a lot of details on your history, kind of from the old Ward stuff that you talked about. But what was your history, I guess, education-wise, and what led you to where you are right now?
Sure, it's a funny story. I actually went to high school up in the Northeast outside of Boston, went to a boarding school outside of North Andover, Brooks High School. Did not get the traditional farm and ranch childhood. Sort of was taking a different track, graduated from there, was planning to go to Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. Oh, just circumstances changed. Came back to the ranch at 18. Decided that's what I wanted to do. Didn't really know a lot at the time. Didn't have the background that a lot of these kids have today that have grown up in it. Going to, back then it was Texas A&I, now it's Texas A&M Kingsville. I like to tell everybody I crammed my 4-year degree into 5.5. Got my bachelor's in animal science there in Kingsville. And that really molded me. I think that really, set me back on the path of getting back into ranching. Got a really good education there, a lot of hands-on, worked on the ranch and went to school at the same time, and started my herd as a teenager on my own, and sort of went at it just with what I liked, what I remembered as a kid, and tried to duplicate that. And that's what we've stuck with all the way through, just, breeding the old bloodlines, the cattle that I remember from the 70s and 80s, and just tried to stick to that. And that's where we are today. We've never really deviated much from that. So that's our story on kind of how we got started. And I've been here ever since. Don't really do anything else. This is my full-time job, and it's fun at times, but challenging at times. But I appreciate the path that we're on, and glad that I got back to the ranch and glad that I've been able to carry it on.
Awesome. Well, from 1993, I guess, till we are now, what kind of genetic pieces and bloodlines have you tinkered with and put into the cattle that ultimately make up what your cow herd is today?
Well, that's a great question. Now, we started off, a lot of our cattle would go back to some U.S. sugar breeding, the Rex Crota bloodlines. We used a lot of Imperator genetics in the early days, and we used a lot of old Manso breeding, a lot of the older bloodlines from J.D. Hudgens that I remembered as a kid or that were popular at the time. So a lot of you remember the bulls, some of you might not, but we used a lot of Charlie Manso, a lot of Bross, a lot of 615, Gregory, a lot of the older bulls that you'll still see in pedigrees, but they've sort of faded out in modern time. There's a lot of bulls now that have certainly passed those bulls up, but we kind of held on to those. They represented the type of cattle that we remembered seeing growing up, and we sort of gravitated to that phenotype. Certainly that's changed over the last 30 plus years, but we've still kind of held on to that traditional, I call it old school, just for lack of a better word. But those would be some of the bloodlines that would be influential that we started with. And we've used some other blood along the way, but those would certainly be the three most important bloodlines that got us our start.
So of those bulls that you mentioned there, with like Charlie and Gregory and a lot of those bulls like that, when I see those bulls in my mind and from pictures and things like that, I imagine kind of a moderate framed animal that has massive capacity, huge rib cage, extremely deep bodied, easy fleshing type cattle. And when I think of cattle that you guys breed there at Lazy J, that's the image that comes to my mind. So that it sounds to me like those are the cattle that tend to work in that area, and that y'all have just focused on it and hammered it in for generation after generation. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I mean, we grew up in a time when that was sort of the standard that these cattle presented, physically, sort of a more moderate animal, a lot looser hided animal, maybe not necessarily the most showy or the most, pretty animals, but very functional, moderate sized, easy fleshing, just sort of a workhorse, blue chip type Brahman cattle. And that's what we've used a lot of the old Manso blood and still try to even today. I would say the trends have changed. You don't see as many of those cattle now as you used to. I think a lot of the cattle now have gotten a little bit cleaner, probably a little bit larger, but mainly our environment sort of dictated the type of cattle that we could ranch here. I've had people ask me a lot of time, why'd you pick these smaller type cattle? And we really didn't pick the cattle. They sort of picked us. Our environment sort of dictated that. And over time, the cattle just developed into a certain phenotype because that's what this environment requires. And that's what we've stuck to. And it's sort of becoming a different, I wouldn't say bloodline, but it's a different type of Brahman really than what you see more so now with the popular bloodlines that are out there.
I like that. You're basically using kind of natural selection to pick your breeding stock for you. Could you tell some of our listeners, I mean, we've visited with a few people that run cows in South Texas, but could you describe that environment for those that are maybe a little less familiar and kind of the demand that puts on your cow herd?
Sure. I think the biggest word is just dry. We don't get a lot of rain, and when we do, it's very sporadic and hit and miss. We average about 25 inches a year here. The problem with that is you can get 10 inches in a month, and then you've got 11 months to try to stretch out the next 15 inches. And so it can get very dry very quick and can stay dry for a long time. So volume is an issue as far as forage goes. We don't get a lot of tonnage per acre, and you can't run as many cattle to the acre. And what they do get is strong. I will say that if it does rain, we've got some great country. It's just the if is the big variable. But the smaller cattle do better here. They can just meet their maintenance requirements easier with what's available. And then whatever's left over, they can put towards reproduction and performance. But the smaller cattle do hold up better just because of the environment that we have. And it might not work for everybody. There's certainly environments where the smaller cattle might not be as applicable, but for us, we just have a very hot, dry, rain poor environment, and you've got to make use of the forage that's there. And we just feel like the smaller cattle are more efficient in doing that.
I couldn't agree more. What would you consider, I guess, to be kind of your ideal frame size? And then if you could describe to Brandon and I what your, I guess, ideal cow would look like for your environment.
Sure. I would say, our ideal frame would probably be somewhere in that maybe 5 or 6. 6 might be pushing it, but I would say more so than frame, we kind of go by mature cow size, and I would say that maybe 1,000 to 1,150 range of mature cow size is really efficient for us. And what we look at in our cattle are just phenotypically, we want that animal to have a big, deep rib, deep flank. They need to have some loose hide, and I can kind of touch on the loose hided side of things. We've done a lot of research on our ranch with sort of hide conformation. We need those looser hided animals, but big rumens, really easy keeping cattle that are structurally sound. They got to be able to walk. That's a big selection criteria for us. If they can't walk, they typically don't hold up long in the herd and will be culled out. I look at the drawings that you see on the standard of excellence for the bull and the cow that used to be passed out by the association, may still be now. That really does look like our cattle. That bull and that cow that you see in those drawings that accompany the standards. And if you read the standards, it's sort of what we still adhere to today. I mean, I would say on our ranch, a 1,200-pound cow would be a pretty big cow. We do have some that will be that heavy, but they'll typically be, around that frame 5, or some of them might even be smaller, might even be closer to a 4. But that would be our ideal cow. That's kind of what we look at. And we select more for that than I think anything. Really, the hardiness and the easy keeping, the efficient, and the cattle that can do that for, 10 to 15 years straight.
So everything you described kind of brings me back to the first Lazy J ad I ever saw when I was a kid. And it was an old cow, and I can't remember her number or her name or anything like that, but it was a picture of her, and she was like 20 years old and had a perfect calving record and things. But that's the kind of cow that she looked like. It just huge middled, moderate framed, had lots of extra skin. Do you remember the ad that I'm talking about? This would have been late 90s, mid to late 90s.
I vaguely do, and it sounds like, a lot of our ads, we've sort of pushed that narrative from the very beginning days, and that was kind of our, for lack of a better word, kind of our niche that we tried to fill was, we wanted to keep that old school look of the Brahman intact and keep that efficiency, out in the pasture. So yes, I can remember those style ads. We ran those quite a bit in the mid to late 90s. Don't do as much of that advertising there anymore, but the style of the animal has never really changed. And getting back to the loose hided nature of things, you certainly don't want so much hide that it becomes objectionable and you have problems with sheath or other, instances where it could be a hindrance. But we've done a lot of studies on the ranch, especially during the dry times like we're in now. And we go out there and do body condition scores on all the mature cattle. And one thing we noticed was those cattle that were real tight hided, that had real shallow flank, not much navel, not a lot of dewlap, not much wrinkle in the skin, but were pretty tight made. When things got tough, they were usually the first cattle that started to suffer in their body condition scores. And then if things stayed difficult, usually were the first cattle that would start to skip. When you would go in and pregnancy check those cattle, a lot of those tighter hided thin cattle would be open. And so over time, those cattle were culled, and doing that over a long enough period of time, you ended up with cattle that typically were, a lot looser made. And that's probably something that we'll have to go back and revisit, because you certainly don't want it one extreme to the other. And that may be something we need to look into, maybe moderating that. And I think that's the kind of the key word for everything we do is, if I had to sum it up in one word, it's just moderate.
Yeah, everything you're describing there, it just floods my mind with just thinking about like Jack O'Garrett herd and the Guy Jeans herd and things like that. Those cattle that really fit their environment, which tended to be a tough environment, a little bit different than yours because they had some more rain and things like that. But those kind of cattle that they bred for generations and generations and decades, those are the ones that just kind of made it through and just kept pushing along and maintained themselves. So I can really see that.
You mentioned the Garrett family, and we still see a few of those bloodlines in some of our cattle today. Even we visited some those operations in that area and saw those types of cattle, and it was nice to see that we weren't the only ones sort of with that philosophy or that style of animal. And there's fewer and fewer of us out there with that, phenotype selection. But there are more and more people that are appreciating that functionality and that efficiency. And I like to think that it's kind of catching back on again, and people are appreciating it more. And we've never really deviated. The times that we've tried to go in a different direction, it typically hasn't worked well for us in the long run. So we've just decided that we're going to stick to that and hope that others will appreciate it. And there might be some more out there doing the same thing.
I'm kind of reminded of Barbara Mandrell and George Jones. I was country when country wasn't cool. Throughout the history of cattle breeding, there's always been those people that towed the line and maintained and never deviated from their discipline of cattle breeding, of functional, productive cattle. And then there's always those people that kind of go, that I guess you would call it trends and trend chasers and stuff like that, who deviate to chase the hot trait here or there, and it kind of acts as a wave. Well, at some point along the line, it always kind of comes back to that until the next trend comes, back to production and function until the next trend that's cool and things like that comes along. But I feel like we're in a period right now where function is cool again. It's really fun to be here right now. And over the years, we've incorporated some of the Garrett cattle into our herd and love them. They're just low input, easy maintaining, get the job done type cattle. And so, like I said, it's really fun to be a part of this deal right now when you were country, when country was cool, back into style.
No, I appreciate that. I think we even ran an ad one time that sort of had that same message that, we've been preaching moderate a long time before it even really became a buzzword. And just because we appreciated what it could do for us and our environment, we knew there was other people ranching in these environments that could utilize it and that it would help them. And so we've been on that train for a long time, and it's nice to see, it's sort of getting some exposure now, and we're hoping we can keep it going. And we've actually even transitioned now and trying to incorporate these genetics into an F1 program and seeing what it can do even in a crossbreeding scenario, and really appreciate these genetics crossed on the Hereford and utilizing the same principles that we did in our purebred operation, now adding another, arm of it into an F1 program and seeing how that's going to turn out.
I agree with both y'all guys too. I have got to see the narrative kind of change a little bit, and profitable, efficient cattle that are functional seem to be kind of the cool buzzword right now. But we've gotten to infuse a little Imperator genetics in our herd, a little Jack Garrett stuff, even some Parton kind of heart bar bred stuff. But it does seem like those type of cattle are harder to source nowadays than maybe they would have been 50 or 30 years ago. And so for y'all's program, do y'all almost kind of operate as a closed herd, or will you reach out and use some outside genetics when you get the opportunity?
That's a good question. We try to keep it as closed as we can, but we do understand we don't want to breed ourselves into a corner or get too much of an inbreeding coefficient and start to have some detrimental effects. So we do try to reach out from time to time, but you are right, it is harder to source those genetics. It's not like it was when I was a kid and you had a lot more operations spread out over a bigger geographical area, and you had a lot of production in Florida that's now gone to development and real estate values, and even along some places in Louisiana that have now been taken in by civilization. So it's tough to find those, but they are still available, and we still go and hunt them up, and we tend to be very sensitive to the pedigrees of the animals. We know the bloodlines that work, and we know sort of what to look for. Old Imperator genetics, old Manso genetics, old U.S. sugar genetics. And of course, that's a pretty big, broad statement. I mean, within those, there's ways to chop those bloodlines down even further. But I guess our easiest way is maybe if we can find a bull that checks all those boxes, but maybe is a little bit of an outcross, we can bring that bull into the herd and have that be our way of staying the course, but getting a little bit of outside blood so we don't, get too inbred, but just finding those genetics and being sure you are confident in the pedigree and in the lineage, and that you understand exactly what you're getting before you bring that in and put it across your whole herd.
Going back to something you said earlier about that standard of excellence, bull and cow, especially that cow. When I see her, that old Ted Mangum cow, that's the type of animal that I think when I think about your cattle there at Lazy J. And it's amazing to me that you've stuck to that type throughout the years. My question that I'm leading up to is, I've heard you mention Ted Mangum before, and I know kind of some of his breeding philosophies from, people talking about him over the years. But who would be some of your mentors or people that you kind of looked up to for breeding and guidance in this quest for functional, real world type cattle?
Well, that's a great question. I'm probably going to leave some people out, so hopefully they'll forgive me. But, I think early on, guys like Jack Keel, and I don't know if many people remember him, but that JK prefix, probably most well known for the Bozo bull, but he had a very similar bloodline to what we have today. Probably Wayne Foster, can't leave him out. He was very influential in our early days. And then as we sort of grew up and matured, we dealt with Larry St. Cyr and his family there in Raceland. He was our real tie to the Imperator cattle, and he introduced us to some of the Marceau family. And then moving on, guys like Mike Parton, Marcus Shackelford, the Kempfer family. And like I said, I'm probably going to leave some people out, but that would be a pretty good, shotgun spread of some guys that we dealt with, and we still deal with some of those people now. Unfortunately, some of those people have passed away, and we've lost some of that connection, but we still try to gravitate to those types of individuals, and it's getting harder and harder. None of us are getting younger, so we hope some younger people will pick up the torch and keep the lines going so that we don't lose that functionality entirely. But that would be a good, just shot across on some guys that we looked up to and that we still deal with today.
Well, that's a pretty good roster of people to be counted as mentors and friends and things like that.
For sure. We visited multiple of those ranches that you mentioned, whether it be Marcus Shackelford's and Kempfer's, and some time we've spent in Florida. We've outsourced and bought some cattle from Parton's, used some of Parton's bulls. And so I would think that we definitely align similarly in the cattle that we've kind of started to really like and appreciate. Just kind of a conceptual question or learning more about your program. Do y'all do any AI ET work, or do you like to focus on kind of natural production and making sure that the cattle you're using can work in the real world before you even start implementing kind of AI and embryo technology?
Well, that's a good question. We started off doing quite a bit of AI and embryo work in the early days and had some family members that were pretty influential in the embryo transfer technology at Rio Vista there in the early times. Don't do as much now as we used to, but we're actually starting back this next cycle. We're going to go back and do some embryo work, mainly just because some of those foundation cows that we have are getting old, and I feel like we might be running up against time. And getting one calf a year is great, that's our goal, but if we could sort of mass produce some offspring from some of those top cows before they get too old, I think it's necessary at this point in time. Just sourcing these genetics are difficult, and we're sort of realizing maybe the best source is yourself if you have the right cattle and you're confident in it. So recently we've not done a lot of AI work in embryo. We've tried to sort of prove up our herd naturally and really identify with confidence the ones that we want to put into that type of production. And we are starting that back up again. They've made a lot of advances since the last time that we sort of stuck our toe into that. And now with some of the progress in IVF and sex semen and some other things, I think there may be some better opportunities for success. And we're looking forward to giving it a shot to see if we can kind of crank up our production and really get the offspring out of our most elite cows.
I like that. I like your philosophy on flushing or embryo transfer. It's not that you're trying to make rapid change or change anything in general. You're really trying to make a whole lot more of what you've already got.
Right. Just try to keep it going and, source your own genetics. We'll probably go back and use some older bulls on our cows. So they'll be similar pedigree, but hopefully far enough away separation that we don't get too much of an inbreeding coefficient. And that's something we watch. Thankfully, Digital Beef will calculate it for you. And we do look at that to be sure that we're not tipping over into an area where you could be getting some negatives along with the positives.
Where do you like to keep that value at roughly, numerically? Where are we looking at?
I would say most of our cattle are probably going to be, without looking at each one, I mean, probably in that 6 to 8 in a coefficient. I've got some that go quite a bit above that. But I think when you get above that, especially 10 or more and start getting into those double digits, there's an old saying that when it works, it's line breeding, and when it doesn't, it's inbreeding. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, when you concentrate, you not only magnify the positives, but you magnify the negatives. And there can be some issues with fertility and health and vigor and instances of that where you don't want to set yourself back if it's not necessary.
Brahman breeders know, you want the finest herd? You have to start with the finest Brahman bull semen, and there's no finer selection than at BRC Ranch. Our champion makers are exactly that, but we know variety is essential. We also offer semen from low birth weight bulls, polled/scurred bulls, and sexed heifer semen. BRC Ranch works to release orders within 3 to 5 business days, but you can always stop by the ranch to pick up your order too. Bring the top Brahman sires to your ranch. Go online to shopbrcutrer.com.
You had mentioned potentially going back and using some older bulls and things like that. You may not feel comfortable telling us, but if you would, I'd love to know kind of some of the bulls that you had in mind.
Right. No, I think it would probably be, we used a lot of 229 when we were growing up. That was a very influential bull. And if you look historically back at a time when there wasn't a lot of embryo transfer, a lot of mass production, that bull was producing naturally a lot of champion bulls and a lot of influential bulls, sort of the old way.
Yeah.
And really, if you trace back these cattle, a lot go back to that bull. So I think going back, maybe not necessarily all the way back to 229, but going back into that generation of bull, whether it be some old Imperator bulls like the old 954/3 or 239 or 800, or even getting into the sugar line and looking at bulls like 229 or 402 or 206. I think just going back into that generation is probably what we'll do. Phenotypically, they'll be similar to our cattle, but it'll get us some separation and sort of, I look at it like you're resetting the process. You're setting it back to a time, and it gives you some flexibility in your breeding. I feel like I know the cattle better now than I did when I was a teenager, how to mate them and what their strengths and weaknesses are. So we'll probably go back into those bloodlines. And thankfully, we purchased a lot of that semen back when we were kids, when stuff like that was available. And you could get the old blue paper AI certificates and stash them away and
Yeah.
have them for a rainy day. So that's sort of what we're thinking we're going to do in our embryo program.
So, so a lot of our younger listeners and breeders and things like that, you hear them talking sometimes about going back and using the old bulls and things like that just because they're old. But just because they're old doesn't necessarily mean they're good. But the bulls that you just mentioned were great. And just for our younger listeners' purposes, are knowing and understanding, the 229 bull you're referring to is Sugarland's Rex Crata. And then, but some of those numbers that you, like 239, that Imperator bull had those great big horns and stuff like that, made phenomenal daughters that just lasted for a long time. And the quality that they transmitted generations past themselves in terms of production is fantastic. So it's not like you're just going back and using old stuff because it's old, but I would say it's proven
Right.
over and over and over. Yeah.
Now, that's a good point. We've actually gone back sometimes and tried to bring back some older bulls, used them, and then realized that, like you say, you can't go back and use old bulls just because they're old.
That's right.
The Brahman breed has made a tremendous amount of progress over the years. You definitely don't want to go back in time unless you have a purpose and they're proven and you know what they're going to be able to bring to the table, because we have made a lot of progress with disposition, fertility, and structure and carcass merit and all those things. So, I think going back in time, you want to be careful and understand what it is you're looking for and trying to find the bull that will match that. We've definitely gone back and used some older bulls, got a calf crop and said, oh, that didn't work. But we feel like we've done it long enough and we've sort of taken our lumps that I feel confident in what bulls will work and what we will try, and what bulls maybe, it might be a bridge too far. It may be too far back to be able to integrate them, into our program now. But definitely, I tell people all the time, we don't go and use older bulls just because it's vintage, like a vintage Scotch.
Yeah.
We don't do that. We try to do it with purpose, and we try to ask people that know or that have been exposed to them, older breeders, like Marcus Shackelford or Dr. Husfeld, or when Mike Parton was around. We would bounce those ideas off those guys, and they can sure keep you out of the ditches and happy to, to kind of steer you in the right direction.
Yes, sir.
Well, somewhat controversial buzzword, but something I just wanted us to kind of talk through here briefly. So, show cattle. Y'all have shown no cattle. I have not seen any participation at shows, and y'all don't implement any show cattle genetics. So just kind of talk us through what your opinion is on showing cattle, and permission to speak freely. You can kind of lay it out exactly how you see it and not worry about stepping on our toes, because we will probably agree with you.
No, I definitely am not shy to share my opinion. Showing cattle's a great tool. It's great, a way to advertise, promote, get your cattle out there, see how you stack up. We don't show mainly because we don't feel like our cattle match that environment. The cattle in the show ring typically tend to be a little bit bigger than what we produce, probably more performance, larger mature cow size than what we can sort of handle. And we didn't feel like we wanted to put our cattle, out there to compete with those show cattle, in the same sense that those cattle probably don't want to come down here and compete with our cattle out in the pasture. So we sort of stay out of that, but I certainly appreciate the people that utilize it. It can be very effective in marketing, especially in the export markets and the international arena. Super important. That's a whole nother segment of the breed that we don't operate in, but it's, from a financial standpoint, it's certainly very significant. I guess my only comment or my wish in the show ring was, and it may be changing, but I would love to see a time where these two segments of the breed could sort of intersect and have some commonality, where you could get the type of functional cattle to have a place in the show ring and vice versa, where the cattle that were being championed, would have a prominent role out in the pasture, and try to find a happy middle ground. And I'd like to think maybe that is coming around and changing. You occasionally do see now some champions from some big shows that are sort of leaning back towards that functional cattle, but we never participated in it because we didn't feel like our cattle could match up, and that really wasn't at the time what the show ring was looking for. And so it's sort of like beating your head against a wall. We didn't want to do that.
No, that makes perfect sense. It's just I kind of knew the answer that was coming, but just wanted you to address that. So we're kind of starting to wrap up a little bit. We've got plenty of time, and so you can kind of kick it in whatever direction you want and not feel guilty about it. But I just wanted to put the ball kind of in your court, and I guess we could say just let you set the record straight. So is there anything that's on your mind or on your heart that you feel like the Brahman community needs to hear?
That's a big question. I'm not sure what direction to take that. I think, there's probably two things that always sort of come up when you get to this, topic. I would like to see more emphasis on finding a place in the beef industry for the Brahman again. I feel like maybe in time we might have lost our way a little bit and maybe focused on some things that were outside of production agriculture, outside of the mainstream segment of the beef industry. I'd like to see some more focus on maybe promoting and really advocating the strengths of the F1, using that F1 in a crossbreeding program where you can still capitalize on the carcass traits of the other breeds and use the Brahman as an environmental or heterosis component of that. I think it's a big part of the beef industry that we've maybe lost a grip on. The whole Gulf Coast could really utilize a percentage Brahman in their cow base. I'd like to see us focus back on that more. And then, from a 30,000 foot view, I'd love to see a way to unify the association. I know my personal experience, I spent decades as a board member, as a committee chairman, served on the executive committee, and was an officer for a period of time. And we've been through a lot of change, a lot of turmoil, a lot of division, and feel like a lot of times we've become our own worst enemies with the fighting that we've had sort of in and amongst ourselves. And I'd love to find a way to unify the groups and all get behind the breed. We've got a really great breed of cattle, a very unique breed, and it has a place. And I think it would do us all a service to sort of get behind the breed instead of getting behind each other or getting behind factions in and amongst the breed, and try to rally for the cow, because that's really what we all have in common. And that's why we're all in this, and would love to see that maybe sooner rather than later.
Yeah, what were we talking about, Keaton, the other day? If the strength of the Brahman cow is being a Brahman, and it's the people that are screwing them up.
Yes.
So but left to her own devices is, extremely impactful. And like on the F1 side of things, it's like that thing is the biggest elephant in the room, but it's so big that you don't realize it's there, you can't see the forest through the trees type deal.
I think that's exactly right. I kind of have an old saying when it comes to the Brahman cattle. If the cattle were completely trouble-free and you had no issues whatsoever, you might be able to navigate sort of the turmoil and the friction amongst the breeders. And then, conversely, if we had a very unified group of people that were very homogenous and very much rowing in the same direction, then you could work on maybe some of the uniqueness and some of the issues that need to be addressed in the cattle. But when you have some tensions coming from both directions, it can make for an environment where you have a lot of turmoil and turnover. And I feel like we need to work towards sort of flushing that out and all getting, rowing in the same direction.
That's one thing I think that we need to not forget as Brahman breeders, or just in the commercial cow sector in this part of the world too, the value of Brahman. Like where we're at, and probably very similar to where you're at, I don't think that those cows can survive and function properly with less than a quarter ear bred into them, just even at the commercial cow level here in this part of the world. And so I think if we do right by Brahman cattle and are raising the right type of cattle, we will always have a place for them to go because the necessity of them in this area.
Oh, for sure. And I think you're going to see that a lot more. I'm not a big climate change guy, but as far as environment goes, I think, as we're ranching more in these hot, arid climates, also dealing with, pests and just the environmental load, I think you're going to have more and more place for the Brahman, and we need to capitalize on that and not pigeonhole ourselves to one, sector or the other. I think there's a tremendous opportunity along the Gulf Coast to promote that sort of F1 cow to then be bred in a rotation and take advantage of what the Brahman has to offer and use the synergy with these other breeds like Hereford and Angus to really be highly productive and efficient in areas where, straight English cattle may not be able to flourish.
That's right. We've been over the past year and a half or so, we've kind of ventured into Hereford and Angus purebred breeding program here ourselves. And there's a lot of things I love about them, but there's a lot of things that just keep driving me back to that Brahman cow that I'm like, we got to have you. And from time to time, I can get a little discouraged myself and a little down in the dumps because of maybe some things that are going on amongst breeders or this or that, or some, like you say, turmoil. But the necessity for them in this area just keeps driving me back and appreciating Brahman more and more. So it's really cool that no matter what, you got to have her.
Oh, you definitely do in this area. And I think it could be expanded. I think they're showing that they can range further than maybe we originally, thought, or what their traditional grounds were. That's something I would really like to see more focus on. I think we got so confident in the F1 and it was such a known commodity. And you made a good statement. It's such a huge elephant in the room that sometimes you don't even notice it. Sort of like not seeing the forest for the trees, but that's our bread and butter. I mean, and that's been my mentality since we started a purebred operation. Was our goal was, not to win any shows or export our cattle internationally. It was to provide a foundation of genetics that could be utilized domestically in beef production to help these English cattle be able to bring their merit to the table, but in a way that they could survive. And they can't do it without that Brahman influence. And that's been our goal from day one is, be a foundation producer for eventual crossbreeding, because that's where I feel like the actual purpose and place of the Brahman has always been.
That's right.
Well, perfect. Well, we appreciate all your time, Joe, and we're definitely not running you out of here, but was going to kind of give you the opportunity for shameless plug on your program. If someone wants to get a hold of you and kind of source some Lazy J genetics, what's the easiest way to get a hold of you?
Oh, I appreciate it. I guess we're pretty active on social media as far as Facebook goes. We're in the process. I'm not a real technologically savvy guy. We're in the process of getting a website up, but I think Facebook is something we utilize a lot to promote and advertise our cattle. Always easy to get in touch with me through email, and I can give that to you. It's lazyj@granderiver.net. And then, if you just have to call, sure, I take a phone call or a text anytime. But love to have people down here to visit. I would say the one common theme that I always get from people that come down and visit is, they've heard about the cattle, or they think they kind of know, and then they get here and they see them, and the universal reaction is just surprised that there's this sort of different type of Brahman and a whole herd of them that's really unique from what they're accustomed to seeing, and brings something completely different to the table than what, the mainstream cattle are offering. So I encourage anybody, if you want to see something different and sort of put a picture to a description, we'd love to have you down here. And we call it the $5 tour. We're not big, but we'd love to give you a tour and kind of show you what we're up to.
So when I think of George West, I think of 281 running north and south and 59 running east and west. In relation to that, where's your ranch at?
Sure. I'm about 6 miles south of the town of George West off of Highway 281 South. So if you get to the town of George West, get on 281 like you're going to go to Alice. You go about 5 or 6 miles south of town, and we're ranching in that country back there on some family land, and don't have a big operation. We probably are running about, between 80 and 100 registered mama cows, and we're doing some F1 Hereford and Angus crossbreeding, and then still pure breeding our really elite cattle to keep those core genetics in production.
Perfect. Well, I really enjoyed kind of listening to your philosophies and knowing that we have similar philosophies that we share in relation to the cattle. Before we get to the point we're wrapping up, there's a couple of questions that we always like to ask our podcast guests. And so the first one would be kind of, what's your pet peeve when it relates to Brahman and the Brahman world today?
Wow. I'm not sure I have enough time. I might have run out of time. I think my pet peeve, and it's been from an early day, is I think as purebred Brahman breeders, we sort of get the idea that everything that we produce is worthy of keeping and marketing and selling. And, we're pure breeding, so everything we have is good and it's all got a place. I think my buzzword is culling. I think culling is a tool that needs to be used quite a bit more than it has been. And I think we need to put more selection pressure on these cattle as far as fertility, structure, disposition, all those buzzwords. I feel like a purebred breeder's duty is to offer the very best seed stock. And in order to do that, I think you really need to do some self-evaluation and really look at those cattle and be sure that what I'm offering really is the best and brings the right traits to the table. And the other animals need to be marketed in a way where they're not getting into the production system and not getting into our genetics, so that we don't keep propagating some of the issues that over time has given the breed a black eye. I think the way to get rid of that is to actually get rid of those cattle and really tighten down your criteria so that you can feel comfortable when you sell something that it's going to represent the breed properly and do a justice to the breed instead of being something that's a negative.
I couldn't agree more. We've talked about that in previous podcasts. So there's a difference between a registered breeder and a true seed stock breeder. And a lot of some of the registered cattle, specifically Brahman related, we're talking about Brahmins that have been trading hands, maybe needed to be in a beef program more than they needed to be in a breeding program.
Right.
Perfect. Well, our last question that we'll go ahead and wrap up with, and just kind of a fun question, no pressure to it, but what is your favorite Brahman animal of all time?
Oh, I guess favorite of all time, just taking all the things into consideration, probably the 229 bull of U.S. Sugar. I mean, I grew up in that time, and that bull was very influential when I was young. Probably have more semen on that bull than any one old bull out there, and just feel like for his time, what he brought, that phenotype, that hip, that top line, that, easy keeping animal that crossed well on some of the foundation genetics. I think he'd be pretty tough to beat for us.
Proven. I think that's kind of the one thing that we talked about when you mentioned a lot of the bulls that you were using in your program. They're not just random old bulls that you grabbed out of the tank. They're bulls that time and time again have proven to work efficiently in kind of the system that you've developed. And so appreciate that. First of all, thank you, Joe. If there's anything that we didn't get to that you feel like you wanted to get out in this podcast, here's your kind of opportunity if you have anything specifically you'd like to say.
Oh, I think we covered it really well. I really appreciate the invite, appreciate your time, and appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of our story. And hopefully it might touch on somebody and we might be able to help them.
Yep, absolutely. Hopefully we can recruit some young breeders like you talked about to kind of share some of the mentalities and philosophies that you've been propagating over time. Brandon, any kind of last thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of this podcast. While some people's philosophies may differ into where they want to spend their focus on, whether it's show or production or this or that, I think the key is communication and just getting people exposed to one another, because this breed is full of really good people. But sometimes philosophies might get in the way, but getting to know people and stuff like that, I think it's awesome that we can kind of mesh everybody together and let people appreciate one another. I really appreciate your time today, Joe, and really enjoyed the visit.
Well, thanks so much.
Absolutely. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you for your time, Joe.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Over the Hump podcast. Our passion is Brahman cattle, and it runs deep. And this show is about its rich history, industry trends, and stories that define the American Brahman. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, find us on Instagram and Facebook at Cutrer. See you next time on the Over the Hump podcast.